She found him bleeding in her barn, an Apache Raider, barely breathing, hunted by men who would kill them both. As a widow on the edge of nowhere, she should have turned him in. Instead, she hid him. Days later, the soldiers returned and forced her to marry the very man they were hunting. Now, bound by law and war, two enemies must survive under one roof. But trust is fragile, and mercy comes at a cost. What happens when a settler woman and a wounded warrior are forced to choose between love and loyalty, while a nation watches with rifles raised? The wind clawed across the prairie, dry and mean, carrying with it the ghost whispers of things long buried, bones, prayers, promises. She stood alone beneath a low sky the color of old tin, hammering a warped plank across the doorframe of her cabin. The nails screeched into the wood like a warning. Her breath misted in the air, even though it was too warm for that. She hadn't spoken aloud in 2 days. There was no one left to listen. The earth here cracked like old hands, sun-scoured and bitter. Her garden had died back in July, and the only thing that grew now were thorns along the fence. She'd named the place Mercy Ridge once. Her husband had laughed at that, said Mercy never reached this far west. He'd been right. He was buried beneath the lone mesquite, behind the barn, marked by a cedar post and a ring of stones she arranged when the ground was still soft enough to dig. Now it was iron, the kind of ground you shoot into, not bury dreams in. She carried her shotgun everywhere. It was too long for her, heavy in her arms, but she moved with it like it was part of her spine. Her hair had grayed at the ends, once gold, now ash, and the lines around her mouth stayed even when she wasn't frowning. She didn't look like a widow. She looked like someone who'd stopped pretending she was anything else. That night, the storm came without lightning. Just wind and the hard slam of cold rain. It hammered the roof like angry hooves. She lit a fire, drank water boiled with dry mint leaves, and listened to the creak of her cabin walls as they resisted the night. Then the horses stirred. A thump in the barn, not the kind the storm made. She stood up slow, every movement deliberate, picked up the lantern, and stepped out into the wind. Rain struck her face sideways, stinging like nettles. She moved barefoot across the wet dirt, feeling the tremble in the earth more than hearing it. The barn door was cracked open. She should have called out, but instinct overruled habit. She raised the shotgun and edged inside. The lantern flickered orange across pitch-dark beams, hay glistening with rainwater. Something moved. At first, just the rustle of straw, like a rat. But then a shape emerged, bigger than any rodent, slumped and breathing. A man, dark hair soaked to his shoulders, bare chest streaked in blood and mud. One leg twisted awkwardly, and a bullet hole-bloomed just below the ribs. She aimed. He didn't flinch. He stared straight at her, jaw tight with pain, but not fear. Not begging. Not pleading. Just waiting. He was Apache. The patterns cut into his arm told her that before his skin tone did. She'd seen men like him ride past in the distance, never this close. Never this broken. Her breath caught. The barrel trembled slightly. She should have pulled the trigger, but her finger hovered on the curve, unwilling. Her mind flashed back to a moment that no longer existed. Her husband laughing in the same barn, a bluebird perched on the fence, a child that never came. The man blinked slowly. Then his eyes rolled back, and he fell into the straw. She swore under her breath and moved quickly, almost angrily, as if trying to undo the decision even as she made it. She slung the shotgun across her back, dropped to her knees, and checked the wound. It was clean through, but festering. Old blood mixed with rainwater. He'd been shot maybe a day ago. She dragged him inside the cabin. He was lighter than she expected, wiry but not weak. His skin was burning. Fever. She laid him on the floor near the fire, stripped the soaked blanket off him, cut his shirt away. She boiled water, tore one of her petticoats into strips, cleaned the wound. He muttered something in his tongue, words like cracked stone. She didn't understand, but it didn't matter. She'd been spoken to in English, and still never understood half the men in her life. He slept, sweating, twitching. She sat nearby, shotgun in her lap, eyes on the flames. She told herself she was keeping him alive for answers. to find out what side of a raid he'd been on. Maybe he knew who killed her husband. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it didn't matter. The fire hissed as a log shifted. Outside, the wind dragged across the cabin like a hand searching for a door. By morning, he was still breathing. For 3 days, he said nothing, just watched her from beneath half-lidded eyes. She fed him broth, changed his bandages. He never thanked her, never asked to stay. On the 4th day, she found him standing outside, shirtless in the wind, watching the sky. She didn't tell him to come in. That evening, the sound of hooves cracked across the silence. She stepped onto the porch and saw them. 4 riders in brown dusters, wide-brimmed hats low. Locals. Ranchers. Men who played sheriff when no lawman came this far. The leader, a tall one with a rope coiled at his hip, tipped his hat. "Evenin', miss. Saw your smoke. Thought we'd check you hadn't been scalped." She didn't smile. Not yet. They dismounted, looked around. One peered through the barn door. Another walked the perimeter. "There's talk of an Apache party nearby," one said, eyes narrowing. 3 men killed at Hunter's Creek. "We figure one of 'em might be limping. Wounded. You seen anyone?" She lied. Her voice was steady. "No." The tall one stepped closer. "You sure? Don't seem right, a woman living out here, all alone. Dangerous." "I've got danger handled." He glanced at her hands. "No ring. You'll need someone to help tend this place. Maybe I come by in a few days, see if you change your mind." She didn't answer. They left, dust curling behind them like smoke. When she stepped back inside, the Apache man stood near the fire, watching her with narrowed eyes. He'd heard everything. She said nothing. He nodded once, like a man paying respect to a line he wouldn't cross. That night, as wind howled across the prairie, she laid her shotgun beside her bed but didn't lock the cabin door. The man she'd once feared now slept just feet away, his breathing slow, steady, human. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was waiting. The days slid by like slow water. The wounded man moved with more strength now, his limp softening, his eyes sharper. He hadn't yet given a name, and she hadn't asked. Some names were burdens, like gravestones you dragged through the years. Still, she watched him closely, how he cleaned the knife before using it, how he paused before entering the cabin, as if waiting to be allowed. A man who lived hunted knew not to take what wasn't offered. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was sand-soft and deliberate, shaped by a language older than fences. He pointed to the stove and said "Kai," then "fire." She repeated it. Awkward. He didn't laugh, but the corners of his mouth twitched like a man who remembered how. She taught him spoon, chair, sky. He pointed to the sky again and said his own word for it. Different rhythm. Same meaning. They were not friends. Not yet. But silence no longer bit. One morning, he brought in a rabbit, clean kill, arrow through the neck. She hadn't known he still had his bow. She didn't ask where it had been hidden. He cleaned it outside, hands stained red, then held it up as if seeking her approval. She nodded. He nodded back. Later that night, over firelit stew, she looked at him and said, "You could have run." He stirred the broth slowly. Nowhere to run. The air between them thickened. Outside, a coyote howled, long and aching. He looked toward the door like he could see the night creatures pacing beyond it. "They'll come again," she said. Yes. She wanted to ask who they were, his people or hers, but left the words unspoken. He knew. That was enough. That week, the smell of horse sweat and smoke returned to the wind before the riders appeared. They came slower this time, more cautious. Not the same men as before. This bunch wore uniforms. Cavalry. Blue jackets, gold buttons dulled by dust. Their leader, a red-faced lieutenant, leaned from the saddle with the confidence of a man who'd never had to dig his own grave. "Ma'am," he greeted. "Reports of hostiles in the area. One wounded. Apache." She squinted against the sun. "Haven't seen anyone but the wind." He dismounted, boots crunching dry grass. Walked the perimeter like a man inspecting livestock. One soldier lingered by the barn door. Another near the well. Her heart thudded behind her ribs, but she kept her breath steady. The Apache stood inside, hidden beneath the floorboards she'd pried loose the day before. The lieutenant noticed the stew pot cooling on the porch. "You get much game out here?" "Enough," she said. He looked her over, weather-worn, thin, but not weak. "You alone?" She stared him down. "Always." He let out a dry chuckle. "That a threat or an invitation?" "Just the truth." They left dust and suspicion in their wake. She waited until their silhouettes disappeared into the trees before lifting the floorboard. He emerged like a shadow, unspooling, sweat glistening down his neck. "They're not just looking," she said. "They're hunting." He met her eyes. They will not stop. That night, they spoke more than they had since the first day. Sitting across from each other, firelight bouncing off the cabin walls, she told him about the night her husband died. Not with tears, those had dried like the creek beds, but with a stillness that felt heavier than grief. He'd been gut-shot during a raid. She had dragged him back from the barn and held his hand while the life drained out of him. "I was angry for a long time," she said. "At the men who killed him. At him for dying. At God. Then I just stopped feeling anything." He didn't offer pity. Just said, "I was 12 when I watched soldiers burn our village. I stopped feeling things too." She studied his face in the firelight. Sharp cheekbones, scar near his temple, eyes like polished onyx. Not soft, but honest. In the days that followed, a routine formed. She'd gather wood, he'd chop it. He'd hunt, she'd cook. When she taught him how to write the letter E, he frowned and said, "This shape makes sound?" She smiled for the first time in weeks. Not just sound, meaning. When he carved a piece of wood into a bird and left it on her windowsill, she didn't ask why. She just kept it there. But peace was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as she returned from the creek with a bucket sloshing against her skirt, she spotted a horseman on the ridge, watching, waiting. He rode off before she could raise her rifle. But she knew the message. Time was closing in. That evening, as the wind howled through the eaves, a knock came at the door. She opened it slowly, gun in hand. A man stood there, gray beard, preacher's collar. 2 men flanking him. One held rope. "Evenin'," the preacher said. "Word's out you're sheltering an Apache. Some in town say you've taken him into your bed." Her jaw tightened. "That your business?" He didn't flinch. "Town says it is. We're a Christian place, ma'am. We got laws. If you're harboring a savage, you'll be judged. Unless..." He paused, shifted. The rope man grinned. "Unless you're willing to make it right. Marry him. Bind him under God and man. Then he's your burden, not ours." She stared at them. Rage buzzed at the edge of her teeth. But she saw it, behind the preacher's civility, the rope man's smirk, the quiet threat of fire and noose. She could say no. Stand her ground. Let them drag the Apache out. Hang him from her barn rafters. Torch what was left of Mercy Ridge. Or she could speak one word. A word that changed nothing but might save everything. She exhaled. Yes. The mock wedding was held the next morning. No guests, no prayers, just the preacher muttering lines while wind whipped through the broken fence. She wore her dead husband's coat. The Apache man, silent, still bandaged, stood beside her, his eyes unreadable. No one asked for vows. No one offered rings. When it ended, the preacher said, "It's done." The men rode off, satisfied. She stood on the porch long after they left, arms folded, watching the horizon. He came to stand beside her. "You didn't have to," he said. "I did." He looked down at her hand. Rough, calloused, still clutching the rifle. "We're bound now," she added, voice like flint striking stone. "Not by love. Not yet. But by choice. That's more than most get." He said nothing, just nodded. The prairie wind carried the scent of rain again. But it smelled different this time. Like something new was coming. Not a storm, not death. Something that might grow. The mornings came quieter after the forced wedding, though not more peaceful. A strange stillness settled over the cabin like dust on old furniture, familiar, but not quite settled. She would wake to the sound of his movements, fire being stoked, water boiling, the careful crackle of dry wood. He never entered her room unless she called. But he was always near, like a shadow waiting for permission to be more. She hadn't yet called him husband, not out loud. But in the small rituals of survival, something was shifting. He carved her a spoon from mesquite wood. She left it on the table and used it every evening. He mended the fence where the storm had torn it down. She sharpened his knife without being asked. Their lives were beginning to braid together, not with passion, not yet, but with understanding. Quiet acts earned respect. She caught him once standing by the grave behind the barn, eyes fixed on the cedar post. Her dead husband's marker. He didn't touch it, just stared for a long moment, then turned away without a word. She didn't ask what he felt. She didn't know what she felt either. Some nights, they sat by the fire and said nothing. But it wasn't a silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people who had learned not to fill the air with words unless they meant something. The wind spoke for them, the hush through the pines, the dry leaves dancing across the porch, the distant coyote calling out its lonesome heart. But beneath the softening edges, the threat remained. Always. One afternoon, as she was hanging strips of jerky to dry, he rode back fast, faster than usual. Dust chased the hooves of the mare he'd taken. He didn't tie her, didn't speak. She lowered the meat and met his eyes. Smoke, he said. He led her to the ridge overlooking the northern stretch of the valley. She brought her spyglass, an old brass thing her husband once used to watch for cattle thieves. Through it, she saw a campfire. Then two. Then five. Tiny plumes rising in the dusk. He said the words slowly, like they tasted of ash. Cavalry. How many? Too many. A pause. Then she asked the question she hadn't dared ask since he arrived. Did you raid Hunter's Creek? His jaw worked side to side, not in anger, but in thought. Then no. She didn't know if it was the truth. But it was the first time he'd ever looked afraid. They made plans in the dark. Not to run. That wasn't an option. The townsfolk would say the marriage was a sham, an excuse to shield a savage. If soldiers found him here, they'd shoot first and bury question second. And if they took him alive, they'd hang him just to make an example. I can hide you, she said. No more hiding. Her hand clenched at her side. Then fight. He didn't answer. That night, he slept outside, near the barn, wrapped in a horse blanket, bow at his side. She watched him from the cabin window, torn between fury and a deeper ache. This wasn't her war, but it had found its way into her bones, just the same. She dreamed of blood on the cabin walls, smoke in her lungs, waking up to emptiness. By morning, she decided. She brought him a rifle, her husband's old Winchester, still oiled, still deadly. He looked at it for a long time, then took it without a word. There was reverence in the way he held it. Later, she rode to town, not with surrender, but with purpose. At the general store, she bought salt, beans, and a bottle of whiskey. At the livery, she asked about the cavalry. Camped 2 days north, the stable hand said. Been a skin questions. Got a scout through here yesterday. She played dumb, wore the widow's face. Let her voice tremble just enough to be believed. I married him 'cause they made me, she told the storekeeper. I ain't proud of it. The lie tasted bitter, but it worked. By the time she rode back, dusk had swallowed the horizon. He met her at the gate. She handed him the supplies and told him the truth about the scout, about the whispers, about the noose tightening. We have 2 days, maybe less. Then we use them. They worked together through the night. Reinforced the door. Dug a trench near the back window. He set traps along the western tree line, spike pits, tripwires, sharp branches buried under loose dirt. She lined bullets on the table, cleaned the rifle, loaded her shotgun. The cabin wasn't a fortress, but it could be a grave if they played it wrong. And still, in the midst of war preparation, came something soft, unexpected. She found him outside, beneath the stars, head tilted toward the sky. Moonlight silvered the scars on his shoulders. This land, he said, voice low, it remembers blood. Remembers every war fought on it. The ground knows. She stepped beside him. I don't want to die here. Not like this. He looked at her. Then live with me. The words weren't sweet. They weren't a proposal. They were a vow made in dirt and shadow and silence. She didn't answer with words. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. Not a kiss. Not yet. But contact. A decision. Inside the cabin, the wind pressed against the windows like breath on glass. Outside, the coyotes had gone quiet. Something was coming. But for one moment, they stood together. Two ghosts made flesh again, hands touching under an old sky, and dared to hope the storm might pass them by. The first shot rang out just before dawn. She'd felt it coming, the way a dog senses thunder, an ache in the teeth, a restlessness in the chest. Still, the crack of the rifle jolted her heart like a hammer. She was already at the window, shotgun in hand, when the second shot echoed. A warning, not meant to hit. They were announcing themselves. Through the thin mist, she saw movement at the tree line. Uniforms moving in careful patterns. Blue jackets, yellow sashes, rifles gleaming like water in morning light. Cavalry. He was already outside, crouched near the barn. His bow hung across his back, but he held the Winchester now. In this moment, he looked like something more than a man, part shadow, part memory. A figure of the land itself, risen in defense. She slipped outside and joined him behind the stacked hay bales. They didn't speak. Their plan had been spoken the night before, finalized in silence. No surrender. No running. Not anymore. A voice called out from the ridge. Turn over the savage. That's all we want. It was the same lieutenant from before. She remembered his smirk, the way he'd looked at her like she was something to be owned or saved. She stepped up onto the porch and leveled her shotgun at the open air. He's my husband, she shouted. You come for him, you come through me. The pause was brief, but heavy. You made your bed, woman, came the reply. Don't expect sympathy when it burns. The first wave came fast, two soldiers moving from the east, trying to flank the cabin. He spotted them and fired. One fell. The other dropped flat and scrambled for cover. She ducked behind the porch post and fired twice, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. Wood splintered beside her, and she rolled to the side, breath tight, ears ringing. Smoke thickened in the air. He moved like a ghost, always just ahead of the bullet. Calm. Precise. She saw him take down another man near the well. He didn't celebrate the shot. He simply moved again, melting back into the terrain, as if born from it. They came in harder now, angry. A bullet grazed her thigh, hot and sharp. She didn't scream, just gritted her teeth and kept loading shells with trembling fingers. Pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. The barn caught fire first. They'd thrown an oil lamp, and the dry hay lit like paper. Flames licked up the walls, casting dancing shadows across the battlefield. She watched the horses scream and bolt into the trees, eyes wild. He grabbed her arm, pulling her behind the trough. We don't hold, he said. Not like this. She knew he was right. The cabin was a tinderbox, and they were down to their last rounds. There's a ravine behind a ridge, he added. If we reach it, we can disappear. She nodded once. You go first. He stared at her. No. She gripped his arm. You're the reason they're here. You're the one they want. I'll cover you. He shook his head, jaw clenched. I won't leave you. You already did once, she said quietly. When you didn't die. Don't make that gift worthless. He hesitated, torn between fury and devotion. But in the end, he nodded. She handed him the last of the cartridges. You run like hell, she said. Don't look back. Their eyes locked, a final moment held like breath between lips. Then he was gone. She turned toward the fire, toward the advancing boots, and screamed a warning shot into the air. The cavalry hesitated, then charged. She saw their faces, young, angry, confused. Boys in blue. She stood on the porch, bleeding, scorched, a shotgun in one hand and a broken vow in the other. They fired. The world went white. When she woke, the cabin was smoke and ruin. Ash floated through the air like snow. Her ears rang. Her limbs ached. She coughed blood and sat up slowly, breath coming in ragged pieces. The soldiers were gone. Only bodies remained. Some wore blue. One lay twisted near the well, rope still clutched in his fingers. Another had a feather caught in his coat button, like some cruel joke. She dragged herself to her feet, half crawled, to the barn's blackened shell. No one waited there. No sign of him. For a moment, she thought he was gone for good. But then, soft, almost mist, she heard the whistle. Not a song. A signal. One they'd made together weeks ago, in the quiet, just in case. She followed it through the trees, down the slope, past the scorched trail of bootprints and blood. And there he was leaning against a rock, arm cradled tight to his side, but alive, breathing. She dropped beside him, fingers trembling, eyes wet. He looked at her. You stayed. So did you. They sat in the dirt, wrapped in the silence of the half-dead, and watched the sky change from smoke gray to the soft gold of morning. The war for now had passed, but the land still watched. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the world would come calling again. But not today. Today, she reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. And for the first time, the land whispered something new. Not sorrow, but beginning.